So, today we're going to dive into a collection of ancient Jewish stories that you might have heard of. It's called the Apocrypha. But listen, these are not just some dusty old fables. They were actually a powerful, and I mean powerful tool for survival. A kind of guide for a people just trying to hold on to who they were thousands of miles from home. And really, that brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. It's a question that feels so incredibly modern, right? But for the people writing these texts, it was a life or death reality. I mean, how do you keep your faith, your culture, your whole sense of self when you're just a tiny group inside a massive, powerful empire that's totally different from you?
Okay, so where did this problem even come from? Well, it was born out of something called the diaspora. You see, after these huge conquests by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, Jewish communities were scattered all across the ancient world. They were living as minorities in these huge foreign empires, and they were constantly surrounded by different cultures, different religions, and facing this immense pressure to just blend in, to assimilate, and forget their own traditions.
And just so we're all on the same page, the diaspora literally refers to this historical scattering of Jewish people away from their ancestral homeland in Israel. This experience, this feeling of exile, is absolutely central to understanding the stories we're about to get into.
So how did they cope with all this? Well, part one of their survival kit, if you will, was this sort of inward-looking guide to godly living. And there's no better example of this than the totally adventure-filled story of Tobit. It's basically a blueprint for how to live a righteous life and keep your community values strong even when you're far from home.
The story kicks off with two pretty intense crises happening at the same time. First, you've got Tobit. This guy is incredibly devout. He's even burying the bodies of executed Jews, an act of piety that gets him in big trouble, and somehow ends up leaving him blind. At the very same time, his relative, a young woman named Sarah, is cursed by a demon who has killed every single one of her 7 husbands on their wedding night. I mean, they're both in such complete despair that they actually pray for death.
But, of course, God sends help. Tobit's son, Tobias, goes on this quest and ends up hiring a guide who is secretly the angel Raphael in disguise. On their journey, Raphael tells him to catch this giant fish and save its organs. Now, this is where it gets a little wild. He uses the fish's heart and liver to make this kind of incense that drives away Sarah's demon, which allows them to finally marry safely. And then he uses the fish's gall to miraculously cure his father's blindness. It's this incredible story that basically says, hey, even in the absolute darkest times, divine help is right there if you just stay faithful.
So, the crucial point of the story isn't just the miracles, it's the ethics behind it. This quote from Tobit to his son, it really reveals the core message. Almsgiving or charity is one of the most important things you can do. It's not just about being nice, it was seen as a kind of spiritual investment, a way to store up treasure with God that would protect the whole community when things got tough. All right, let's move on to the next part of this survival kit, because it builds on this. If the story of Tobit was all about strengthening the community from within, these next stories were about defending it from the outside, and they use this amazing tool, sharp wit and satire, as a kind of shield against the appeal of foreign religions. Now, what's so cool about this is how it breaks down the strategy. The letter of Jeremiah just directly confronts that social pressure of being in the minority. It takes this awe-inspiring spectacle of Gentile worship, the gold statues, the huge crowds, and it just systematically dismantles it. It argues, look, these idols are just wood and metal. They can't move, they can't save themselves from a fire. And by the way, the priests are totally taking advantage of you. It's a really powerful way to inoculate your community against that constant pressure to just conform. And this theme continues in another story, but with a super clever twist. Begnil and the Dragon reads less like a religious text and more like an ancient detective story, starring a very clever Daniel who uses pure logic to expose religious fraud. Okay, so here's how the case unfolds. The king is convinced that this idol, Bel, is a living god, because these massive food offerings left for it disappear every single night. Daniel, being a bit of a skeptic, sets a trap. He gets permission to secretly sprinkle fine ash all over the temple floor. The next morning, the food is gone, but the floor is covered in footprints of men, women, and even children, all leading to a secret door. The priests and their families had been sneaking in every night to feast. It's a brilliant way to illustrate the point. This isn't divine power, it's just human trickery. But survival wasn't only about resisting threats from the outside. It was also about making sure there was justice and integrity within the Jewish community itself. The story of Susanna is this powerful courtroom drama about the danger of corruption from within. And the setup is just chilling. You have two respected community elders who are also serving as judges, and they try to blackmail this virtuous woman named Susanna. When she refuses them, they use their power and their authority to publicly accuse her of adultery, a crime that was punishable by death. So as Susanna is literally being led to her execution, condemned purely on the word of these two powerful men, a young man steps forward from the crowd. Yep, it's Daniel again. And he shouts this line, refusing to be a part of this injustice, and he demands the right to question the accusers. And here is the absolute genius of his plan. Daniel separates the two judges and asks them both a very simple question. Under which tree did you see her with the young man? The first judge says a yew tree. The second, thinking he's backing up the story, says a pine tree. And just like that, their lie is instantly exposed. This story is such a timeless warning about the abuse of power, and it's a call for real, thorough justice inside the community itself. So you've got guides for personal ethics, you've got defenses against outside pressure, and models for internal justice. But what was the ultimate motivation? What kept people going through generations and generations of exile? It was hope, a powerful, animating promise for the future. Texts like the book of Baruch and the prophecies you see at the end of Tobit, they lay this hope out so clearly. They start by acknowledging why they're in exile, as a just consequence for their sins. But then they pivot to this powerful promise that God would show mercy, that he would reverse the diaspora and gather all the scattered people back home. And more than that, they had this vision of a future where even the foreign nations around them would come to recognize and honor their God. This was the light at the end of a very long tunnel. So, when you put it all together, you see that these apocryphal texts were so much more than just entertainment. They were a practical, spiritual, and cultural survival kit. They gave people ethical blueprints, satirical shields, models for justice, and a profound reason to hope, all designed to help a scattered people endure. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? This ancient challenge of holding on to your identity in a world that's always pushing you to change, it's a universal one. So it's worth asking ourselves, what are the stories, the guides, the satires, the promises of hope? What are the stories we tell ourselves today to navigate our own challenges and hold on to who we are?